and ownership percentage for Week 8. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. With me is Ricky Sanders at R Sanders DFS. You took a look at running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, as you always do each week, looking at targets and projected ownership. A little bit of a shortened week. I believe, 5 teams on bye. Does that change anything for you?
It definitely changes some things, and a lot has changed since the beginning of the week, to be honest. We now got the C.J. Anderson news, at least what we think is the C.J. Anderson news. He just tweeted that it was false, but it seems like he's going to miss this week. But having less teams obviously affects it. There's less to choose from. It's more likely for guys to be chalky. So in that aspect, it definitely affects things, but otherwise it's business as usual.
Yeah, I think the only thing that really changes, obviously, as you point out, is just kind of the ownership. We'll probably take a tick upwards because you are missing, 5 teams or so.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it just makes sense. It's the same thing for, NBA slates where when there's less to choose from, the guys who stand out as the best plays, more people are likely to play them when there's less to choose from. I mean, if you want to be contrarian, with a lot of games, it's pretty easy, but without a lot of games, there's like 3 options to choose from. So contrarian ain't so contrarian anymore. And while this is a little different, it's a similar concept.
Right. Look at running backs here. You got Ezekiel Elliott as the first one to talk about. In terms of touches and targets, I mean, this guy's been pretty much as consistent as can be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't worry about any matchup at this point. I think his targets as I go through it, this week is probably a little high, but I mean, he's going to get a majority of the rushes against a difficult Eagles defense. But once we saw him, tear up this Packers team that continues to hold down opposing runners, after the game, that dominant offensive line is going to dominate anyone. Basically, he's matchup proof at this point. And Ezekiel Elliott is just a guy that you got to use every single week because of his volume, because of his talent, because of his offensive line, because of his role.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. You look at these matchups, and it's just like, well, best offensive line in football. I think we can, upgrade the matchup pretty much for anyone that faces the Cowboys at this point. Christine Michael, you talk about next. Saints defense that's, been pretty much horrible against running backs all year, and a little bit of a downgrade in terms of pricing compared to really like guys like David Johnson and Elliott this week.
Yeah, Michael's one of my favorite plays, if not my favorite cash game running back play this week against this Saints team, which, last week gave it up again. They're just a pretty awful defense in total. I actually rostered them as a punt in cash games last week, and it ended up working out, thankfully. But watching them was just painful because they – every play, it's not just even runs, it's just every play is like 5 yards, 5 yards, 5 yards, 5 yards. And so, you understand why they've allowed the most rushing touchdowns and total touchdowns to opposing backs. You understand why they've given up the most fantasy points. They're just bad. And Russell Wilson is playing through both knee and ankle injuries at this point. So Michael going to get a full workload. I think they work him into the passing game more than usual. He's usually good for 3 to 5. There are outlier games in there, 6 or 7 targets. And I think this is going to be one of those games where if you look at, what Spencer Ware did last week, that they say, he got it done through the passing game. Maybe we can do the same with Michael. So I think Michael's going to get the goal line touches. I mean, they're going to move the ball against the Saints. Everyone does. He's going to get a ton of touches. So I think he's pretty much a lock for 100 yards rushing, and a touchdown is definitely not a stretch either.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And then looking at Spencer Ware, who gets another cupcake matchup against the Colts. Ware's just been a guy who obviously a little bit matchup dependent, I think, in terms of how they use him. But he's also kind of worked well into the passing game this year.
Yeah, I mean, he caught that what was it, a 46-yard touchdown last week from the slot. So, they're kind of working him around and figuring out ways. I don't want to say Le'Veon Bell-esque, but maybe a poor man's Le'Veon Bell in terms of the way they're working him around. And he's clearly the guy there. I mean, he's putting up, top 5 running back numbers kind of quietly. And now, last week he had the matchup against the Saints. And if you're not playing the Saints, it's the 49ers and then the Colts in terms of other matchups that you would want for, your running back. Everyone is dominating the Colts at this point. Really, I mean, you look at these names, backs Melvin Gordon, Jordan Howard, who during that stretch where he was dominating, Lamar Miller, who's been pretty mediocre except for the week Guess what? He faced the Colts, DeMarco Murray last week. Literally everyone has been tearing this back or this Colts team up. So I have no worries about Ware. Andy Reid loves to pound the ball. He doesn't like to take chances. So Ware going to be involved in the screen game, the running game. I don't think you can fade him again this week.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, he's one of my favorite plays. Then we start to kind of dive into value. Jaquiz Rodgers, you're looking at, I mean, in terms of workload over the last 2 weeks, obviously great matchup against San Francisco, but a pretty decent one here against Oakland.
Yeah, I think it's 56 carries over the last 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, 50, maybe 52. It's definitely over 50, which is pretty impressive for Jaquiz Rodgers. They're just pounding the ball with him. He's combined for 255 yards rushing in the last 2 weeks without Doug Martin. He's turned into, we never thought we'd say that with Jaquiz Rodgers. Remember back in his Falcons days, we thought he was just a receiving back. But he's turned into a workhorse, and he's getting it done. I mean, the right side of this offensive line is all graded pretty positively. And they're pounding the ball, and they're facing now a Raiders team that's allowed the 9th most fantasy points to backs, surrendered the 3rd most rushing yards, and yards is clearly the way he's been getting it done, pounding it. I think Rodgers, whose price rose, might scare some people off, but to me, he's still a monster option and underpriced for a guy seeing this ridiculous amount of a workload.
And with the news with C.J. Anderson, obviously that puts Booker into play. I think we can kind of touch on him a little bit. I mean, is Rodgers now kind of more of a pivot away from him if you want to go to be a little bit contrarian?
I mean, I think Rodgers is still in the cash game talks, but I think Rodgers is more of the pivot from if you don't want to go to, two of the top backs, if you want to spend a little more at the receiver yet again. I think Booker is a must. I think we would agree on that. And the question is, which 2 backs from this first 4 do you feel like using? So I don't think Rodgers is the pivot from Booker. I think Booker's a lock. I think Rodgers would be the pivot from either Ware, or maybe you're using Ware and pivoting from Christian Michael. You've just got to use 2 of those top backs and then pair him with Booker. I mean, Booker for cash games, if you don't use him, you're probably drawing dead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, Booker's going to come in as the chalkiest option with that news opening up. You talk about Latavius Murray as well, who bounced back, I mean, after an injury and had a 2-touchdown week here.
Yeah, I kind of have this feeling like last week, the Dalton, Jeremy Hill, AJ Green stack kind of worked out well. This is projected to be one of the highest scoring games. I think Oakland's going to move the ball, and usually when they do, they get to the goal line. Latavius Murray will have his shots. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a game where Oakland scores, over 30 points total. And so it's one of those weeks where you could do one of those contrarian stacks like Carr, Cooper, if you like him. If you want to go the Michael Crabtree route, just Carr, one of the receivers, and Latavius Murray, kind of like it worked out last week because the offense put up so many points. I think this could be a week with Murray. He's priced like 8,800 on FantasyDraft, which is way too cheap for a guy who clearly, last week they catapulted him back into the role, which is not really that surprising when you consider just how bad the combination of DeAndre Washington, Jalen Richard, and Alawale was while he was out. No one was doing anything. So while Murray's kind of mediocre, he's at least better than those guys. So they're going to give him the volume. Again, he's probably going to need a touchdown in order to be viable, but they're giving him all the goal line carries. I mean, he scored twice last week. They were both carries inside the 10-yard line. So I think he gets them again this week. Tampa's run defense is mediocre. I like Murray, but again, with Booker, he's more of a tournament option at this point.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just given that touchdown dependency on what he needs for a fantasy outcome. Wide receivers, Julio Jones comes in as the top one, gets a Green Bay secondary that's really, really banged up.
Yeah, again, last week, Bears didn't take advantage of it, but that was Matt Barkley. That was Brian Hoyer. That was not, basically the passing game that is flowing the best of any so far this season. I mean, Julio Jones against banged up corners. We saw what he did to Carolina without Josh Norman. I just think he's the top play. I don't really think we need to get into it much more. He leads the position in receiving yards by like 55 yards. He's just having a monster season, and these backup corners aren't going to be able to cover him.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, especially with all the value that we just talked about at running back, he's a guy you can kind of easily slide in and work around it.
Yep, I totally agree.
Mike Evans here coming in at number 2. I mean, this guy has 6 touchdowns in terms of volume. I mean, he's a monster.
Yeah, I really like Mike Evans as the week has gone on. I think I would have added T.Y. Hilton to this chart. I know everyone's on Evans, and I definitely like him, but kind of like last week with Allen Robinson, there's one aspect of this matchup that turns me off a little bit on Evans, and it's the fact that Oakland's top cornerback, David Amerson, is playing unbelievable. He's like a top 5 corner in terms of grade right now in Pro Football Focus, and he's 6'1". So really the guys that can beat him and, have beat this defense so far are some of the shorter speed guys. And Mike Evans is, he's kind of the same kind of receiver as Robinson. He's a 6'4", 6'5" guy who relies on some of the jump balls. And I think this is a corner who's going to make it difficult for him. Do I still think he can succeed and he's going to see a huge volume? Yes. But it's just a caveat that, when you're thinking to yourself on Sunday, late in the fourth quarter, how could this play have flopped? I mean, that's how. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. I just think there is a possibility, whereas, Julio Jones, I don't see him really getting shut down. I do see a scenario where Evans does. That being said, I still love him.
That's a good point. I mean, I think a lot of the industry is kind of looking and go, we're really locked in on Mike Evans this week. I mean, our eyes are just shooting for that ceiling, but we're not looking at the floor at all, and that certainly still is there in that matchup. Obviously, with Winston playing pretty well, but obviously with his inconsistencies, that's part of it too.
Yeah, totally agree. And, Evans has been getting it done. Last year, he was, mediocre because he wasn't scoring the touchdowns. He's scoring them this year. The question is he going to be able to beat a tall corner for a jump ball?
Yeah, definitely. So definitely keep that in mind come lineup construction time. Brandon Marshall here, looking at your contrarian kind of mid-range option for this week, in a great spot against Cleveland. A lot of it's really come down to basically just, can they get him to the ball and kind of do it in open spaces and be productive?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are not giving Marshall credit for how good of a receiver he is. And I think people are kind of feeling down on him right now, but that's a perfect time for him to bounce back. I mean, this isn't like a guy who's only had one good season. This is a guy who's been a great receiver for a long time. And now he draws an awesome matchup against a team that we saw A.J. Green dominate last week. And I did make sure to throw in the caveat that, I saw some people in the industry tweeting how lucky A.J. Green was last week because he caught that bomb. Well, even without him catching that bomb, he still caught 7 passes for over 120 yards. So he dominated this defense. Marshall's the same kind of receiver. Fitzpatrick isn't playing nearly as good a football as Dalton is, but I still have faith in Brandon Marshall in an upper echelon matchup. A guy who scored 14 touchdowns with his quarterback last year. I think that in a positive matchup like this, he can still get it done. I think people are way too down on him. His price is higher than I would like, but that just might mean his ownership percentage is lower as well. So I really like Brandon Marshall this week.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, we talked about at the beginning of the show, with 10 games, maybe looking for a pivot or two. Brandon Marshall seems to be that guy just with everyone kind of keyed in on, there are a couple cheap wideouts, but also Mike Evans and Julio Jones are going to draw, a majority of the ownership.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Julian Edelman here, I feel like I don't know. I mean, I don't think we've talked about him at all since the season's even started.
Probably not. And he's not a guy who on most algorithms is jumping off the page. So I think he's going to be under-owned this week. I think a lot of people are kind of overlooking him. But he had a monster week finally with Tom Brady. It was only a matter of time. We weren't really sure how it was going to work out now with Hogan added. But if we were concerned at all, he pretty much eased those concerns last week. He went back to the guy that Brady was looking for to move the chains, with Gronk kind of the big play touchdown guy, which is what we've come to know with this Patriots offense. And, we give these Bills corners a bunch of respect, but you look at the last time Edelman faced them, he hauled in 11 of 19 targets for 97 yards and 2 TDs, and not really that much has changed in the secondary, to be honest. So I would guess that, if it worked last time, Belichick's going to go back to the well. This whole team, if you want to look into the narrative, they have something to prove after Rex Ryan talked some smack last time. If you're not into narratives, it's just a really quick receiver against corners who are going to struggle to guard him. Any slot corner is going to struggle to guard Edelman because he's so quick. He's got such good hands. So I think that people are kind of sleeping on Edelman. Even if he only goes for 65 yards, he might catch 8 to 9 passes and still be worth it in cash games.
Yeah, definitely. I'm buying into the narrative of Tom Brady just going out there and hanging like 350, 4 touchdowns. I can definitely see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that Rex talking smack earlier in the year is definitely going to motivate all of them, and a motivated Tom Brady will certainly be looking for a motivated Julian Edelman, and that's really all I care about.
Yeah, certainly. Ty Montgomery here, who, I mean, obviously coming off last week, used all over, but was playing some running back.
Yeah, my favorite quote, I started with it, was after the game, Aaron Rodgers being asked about it, and he goes, I guess Ty's a running back now. So they've pretty much accepted to it. Supposedly, Niall Davis, the reporters, he's going to have a role this week, but I don't necessarily buy it's going to be huge because why would they go away from Montgomery, who made it work both as a receiver out of the backfield and as a runner? I mean, he rushed for 6.7 yards per carry. I know it was only 9 carries, but he looked good as a runner. And then, you take into consideration that it's very difficult for defenses to scheme against him. I do that podcast with London Fletcher, and he's like, do you scheme like he's a back or do you scheme like it's a 5 wide receiver set? This is decisions that coaches have to make, and it's really difficult because Montgomery's gone for 10 plus receptions now in 2 consecutive weeks. So you're going to have to decide, is this a good, receiving back, or is this a receiver we have to scheme for? I'm not sure teams have figured it out yet. And it's kind of leading to, Rodgers, I don't want to say replacing, but at least partially replacing the running game with finding his guy Montgomery beating a linebacker, which is just not a fair, matchup. So I think if that continues, we should continue to see Ty Montgomery catch a ton of passes out of the backfield for a reasonable price.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I mean, I think he's going to be a staple in some of my lineups this week. Just as you mentioned, I mean, on PPR sites, he's going to get that for you. Jumping into tight ends, Rob Gronkowski here coming in at the high-priced option, who's, been Rob Gronkowski since Brady's been back.
Yeah, and I did the splits for him. 20.09 PPR fantasy points against the Bills compared to 17.73 against all other teams in his career. So it's a good matchup. I know it's not the same exact personnel, but again, Gronkowski is the best. Brady will be looking for him. He's had at least 90 yards or a touchdown in all 3 games, including both in one of them. So he's just a monster.
Yeah, I mean, he's coming in. It's just a matter of paying up for him. I think that's the only difference. But, I mean, we also jumped down to a guy, Jimmy Graham, who's in a revenge game heading back to New Orleans. Going to be a popular play.
Yeah, the narrative, I mean, the fact that the Saints last year were really susceptible to the position. They've gotten better in theory, but I think it's just because everyone else is beating the hell out of them and they're scoring rushing touchdowns so they don't have to throw the tight end. But I think Graham's a good play. I mean, obviously he had those back-to-back 100-yard games with Russell Wilson. What more is there to say about him? I mean, the revenge game, good matchup, good player, good spot, whereas offense is projected to score a decent amount. Last week he played a Cardinals defense that ranks in the bottom few in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position. So I wouldn't freak out over it. I'm looking for a Graham rebound.
Yeah, I mean, even if there was no narrative, I mean, we'd still be looking at Graham anyway, just based on matchup. And as you point, I mean, the matchup was tough last week. I mean, he still saw about nine targets in that game, and he's been around that 9 target mark over the last 4 weeks. So, he's basically been the more consistent passing game kind of threat there for Wilson.
Yeah, again, I wasn't sure he would ever recover from that injury, but he definitely has, and they're using him like one of their top receivers, which is what we always wanted to see with Graham in this offense. It's coming true, so use him.
Yeah, definitely. Then we look at Jack Doyle, who was the Week 7 darling of the tight end position. Price didn't come up too much, maybe a couple $100 here and there across a few sites, but he's probably going to be a pretty popular play again.
Yeah, and Andrew Luck is really one of my favorite plays of the entire week, and I love all his receivers. The stat I have on Luck is the fact that he's been sacked 2 times or less and 3 times this season, and he's thrown for at least 331 yards in each of those games. And the Chiefs have sacked the least. They've produced the least amount of sacks of any team. So I think Andrew Luck behind that crappy offensive line is actually going to have some time. And you can mix up all the, coverage schemes you want. If you're not getting to Andrew Luck, he's going to make it happen. That's why I love T.Y. Hilton. That's why I love Jack Doyle again. That's why I'm willing to go back to him, is I think Andrew Luck has a big day. Jack Doyle was tight end 1 last week. Not just, in terms of value. He actually scored the most fantasy points of any tight end. So this was a guy who definitely benefited from no Dwayne Allen. We knew last year that Fleener's output went up when Allen was out. So Doyle seems to be, enjoying a similar trend, I really like this matchup for the Colts passing game.
Yes, certainly. And then we look at Cameron Brate, who, I mean, in a matchup, we talked about this one earlier, possibly being one of the higher scoring, games of the weekend. Brate's a guy, I mean, inside the red zone, he needs that touchdown, but, Winston does look his way down there.
Yeah, and if we're saying that we think Evans is going to have a tough time catching a touchdown, then by default, I think that Winston looks to Brate, and that's kind of what I'm going with here. I mean, the Raiders rank 26 in terms of DVOA to tight ends, so it's not like they're great. Brate's kind of been boom or bust. Either he's kind of in the game plan all game, or he's kind of not. And I think this is one of the games where they will want to use him in a high scoring affair, especially if they get down early. So. He's getting a ton of targets near the goal line, so I definitely like him.
Yeah, I do too. And CJ Fedorowicz, I mean, what basically, Detroit is for tight ends, it's comparison to what running backs is against San Francisco. It's just a solid matchup.
Yeah, exactly. And Fedorowicz played a season high in terms of snap percentage last week. The 2 weeks before, he was, tight end 8 combined. This is a guy who I think it was the last 3 weeks heading into last week, was averaging over 60 yards a game. So he's quietly morphing into a very usable punt tight end. And now he draws the dream matchup. So I think Fedorowicz is a guy who should go over 60 yards and probably score a touchdown once again this week. Again, last week, Vernon Davis against his team, 6 receptions on 6 targets. So he was perfect for 79 yards. So I think he was a top 4 tight end when all said and done. It was either 4 or 5 in terms of fantasy points alone. And that's, before he dropped that touchdown. It could have been, tight end 2 in terms of Vernon Davis and Jack Doyle. How's that for your tight ends 1 and 2 for a week? But he dropped it. So I think Fedorowicz can at least approach, tight end, top 5 tight end this week. And he's priced very cheap. I mean, I think the way to go this week is to punt tight end and spend up at the other places for the guys that we talked about.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, there's enough on the board there in terms of tight ends to use. Any kind of parting words for week 8 here?
Yeah, the Colts passing offense. I really, really like them. I think a lot of people are going to be on the cheap quarterbacks like Winston, like Carr. And I have no issue, especially with this Devontae Booker news, paying up for Andrew Luck. I really think that he's a lock for over 300 yards, at least a touchdown. And I think you can even go Luck to T.Y. Hilton and cash. Again, I do this early in the week, and I like to dig into the stats. And once I have, that's a team that even if you're not using them in cash, I would have some exposure to them in tournaments. I know Luck was the number 1 quarterback last week. I think he could get on a little bit of a roll. Again, his Achilles heel is when he's being pressured. When he's not pressured, he's kind of scary.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, Chiefs defense in terms of sacks, I mean, they're, I believe, dead last, right, in terms of getting them. So, yeah, that's a big stat to notice. Possibly Moncrief coming back for week 8, so that definitely gives them a little bit more of an upside, another weapon to kind of fire away with.
Yeah, that's an underrated aspect of this matchup. If Moncrief's back, he's kind of got his full arsenal, not Dwayne Allen, but I think Doyle's at least a good enough for a replacement, whereas he kind of only had T.Y. Hilton last week. If he's got a guy taking the pressure off of T.Y. Hilton, this could be a monster.
Yeah, definitely. Frank Gore's turned back the clock, so, I mean.
Exactly. And I just really like this spot a lot, and I don't think that a lot of people are going to go that route. I think a lot of people these days just think it's got to be bottom of the barrel for quarterbacks, and Luck is actually, a pricing tier below the elites this week, which is kind of shocking to me. So he's, reasonably affordable, whereas, it's not like spending up for Tom Brady. It's still a discount. So I think people are a little, afraid to spend up a little at quarterback, but to me, this is a week to do it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all the value out there. That's going to wrap things up with the target and ownership report for week 8. If you want to head on over to Daily Fantasy Cafe and check out Ricky's article, it comes out on Tuesdays every week, so be sure to check that out. And that's going to wrap things up.